The arrest was supposed to be impossible. A former president, hidden in a neighboring country, protected by silence and plausible deniability, untouchable. Until he wasn't. When Togo's authorities dragged Paul-Henri Damaba out of the shadows, they didn't just detain a man. They detonated a conspiracy that had been running for years. Offshore money, encrypted cells, a synchronized plan to decapitate Burkina Faso's government in hours. But here's what nobody saw coming. Russia knew. Moscow didn't just know, they warned Togo directly. And that single warning collapsed the entire operation before a single shot was fired. This isn't about another African coup attempt. This is about how modern power actually works when the cameras aren't watching. Show more. 9:29 a.m. The arrest happened in silence, but its meaning detonated across West Africa like a delayed fuse finally reaching powder. When Togolese authorities detained Paul-Henri Damaba, Burkina Faso's former military ruler, on their own territory, they didn't just apprehend a man. They confirmed what intelligence services across the Sahel had quietly suspected for months. Lomé had become a launchpad, a rear base, a geopolitical safehouse for a conspiracy designed to topple Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who had seized power in Ouagadougou and dragged Burkina Faso out of France's orbit and into Russia's embrace. This wasn't a spontaneous mutiny brewing in the barracks. This was architecture, a professionally structured operation with offshore accounts, encrypted channels, compartmentalized cells, and a timeline measured in years, not weeks. And when Damaba was pulled from the shadows in Togo, the entire facade crumbled. What had been whispered about in diplomatic cables and intelligence briefings was now undeniable. Someone had been preparing to decapitate Burkina Faso's leadership, and they had been doing it from beyond its borders. This is where the story stops being about one country and becomes about the entire regional order that's been unraveling since 2020. Burkina Faso isn't just another Sahelian state struggling with jihadist violence and military coups. Under Traore, it has become the ideological heart of a new political current sweeping through West Africa, a rejection of French influence, a pivot toward Russia, and a generational revolt against the old guard that governed through Paris and Washington. Traore is young, charismatic, and unapologetically anti-Western. He expelled French troops, pulled Burkina Faso out of the economic community of West African states, and aligned himself openly with Mali and Niger in a new regional alliance built on sovereignty rhetoric and Russian military partnerships. For Paris, for Washington, and for the coastal capitals that still rely on Western security guarantees, Traore isn't just a problem, he's a contagion. And contagions, in geopolitical terms, are rarely left to spread unchecked. Paul-Henri Damaba is the ghost of Burkina Faso's immediate past. He led the January 2022 coup that overthrew President Marc Christian Kabore, promising to restore security and state authority in a country being devoured by insurgent violence. But Damaba's tenure lasted only 8 months. In September 2022, he was ousted by Traore in a second coup, accused of failing to deliver on security promises and maintaining too cozy a relationship with France. Damaba fled. He disappeared from public view, resurfacing occasionally in rumors and unverified sightings. Where he went, who protected him, and what he was planning remained unclear. Until now, his arrest in Togo answers those questions with brutal clarity. Damaba wasn't in exile. He was in position. And Togo, a narrow coastal state wedged between Ghana and Benin, had become his operational base. Togo's role here is not accidental. Under the Nassingbe family, which has ruled since 1967, Togo has long functioned as a political refuge for West African exiles, a quiet facilitator of regional back-channel diplomacy, and a state that prioritizes stability over ideology. Lomé doesn't make waves. It survives by reading the room, accommodating powerful neighbors, and staying just useful enough to avoid being targeted. But hosting Damaba crossed a line. It moved Togo from passive harbor to active participant in a conspiracy that, if successful, would have reshaped the Sahel's political landscape. And when Russia issued a direct warning to Lomé, the calculus changed instantly. This was no longer about offering shelter to a displaced leader. This was about being implicated in a Russian-backed government's overthrow. Russia's involvement in this affair is the fulcrum around which everything else pivots. Moscow has spent the last 5 years embedding itself into the Sahel through the Wagner Group, military advisors, arms sales, and information operations. In Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, Russian contractors have replaced French soldiers, and Russian narratives have replaced Western development frameworks. Traore's Burkina Faso is a critical node in this network. Losing him would fracture the entire axis. So when Russian intelligence flagged the coup plot and publicly signaled Togo's complicity, it wasn't just a diplomatic complaint. It was a threat, a clear message that Moscow would not tolerate interference in a government it had invested heavily in stabilizing. And Togo, which has no strategic depth, no military leverage, and no desire to become a Russian target, had no choice but to comply. What makes this conspiracy distinct from previous coups in the region is its sophistication. Burkinabe counterintelligence didn't stumble onto a loose network of disgruntled officers. They uncovered a multi-layered operation with professional tradecraft. Compartmentalized cells ensured that if one group was compromised, others could continue. Encrypted communications prevented casual interception. Offshore financing insulated the plot from domestic financial surveillance. The plan itself was surgical. Simultaneous strikes on media outlets, telecommunications infrastructure, and key security installations designed to create instant paralysis and information blackout. This wasn't a barracks revolt fueled by grievances and opportunism. This was a campaign designed by people who understood how modern states are captured and how narratives are controlled in the first critical hours. Intelligence penetration was the first layer of Traore's defense. Burkinabe counterintelligence, likely with Russian technical assistance, began mapping the network months before it could activate. They identified nodes, tracked communications, and monitored financial flows. They knew who was involved, where the money came from, and when the operation was scheduled to move. But they didn't move immediately. They waited. They let the conspiracy develop just enough to expose its full architecture, its external backers, and its logistical dependencies. This is a classic counterintelligence approach. Don't disrupt prematurely. Let the network reveal itself completely, then collapse it all at once. And when a moment came, they didn't need mass arrests or public trials. They needed one symbolic action that would send an unmistakable signal. Damaba's arrest in Togo was that action. Strategic signaling is the second layer. Russia's warning to Togo was delivered through channels that ensured it would be heard not just in Lomé, but in Accra, Abidjan, Cotonou, and every other coastal capital that had quietly tolerated or tacitly supported efforts to destabilize the Sahel's new order. The message was simple. This conspiracy is not a local affair. It is a coordinated destabilization campaign backed by external actors. And we know who you are. That reframing was critical. It stripped away the plausible deniability that allows coups to succeed. It made silence complicity and neutrality exposure. Coastal states that might have looked the other way or offered quiet logistical support suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. Backing the coup meant confronting Russia. Ignoring it meant losing credibility with their traditional Western partners. The safer option, by far, was to step back. Perception management is the third layer, and it's the most important. Modern coups don't succeed because of firepower. They succeed because they create the illusion of inevitability. If the population believes the government has fallen, if soldiers believe their commanders have switched sides, if international actors believe the outcome is already decided, the actual use of force becomes almost unnecessary. The conspiracy against Traore understood this. That's why the plan prioritized media and telecommunications. Control the narrative in the first 6 hours, and you control the coup. But Burkinabe intelligence flipped the script. By exposing the plot before it launched, they destroyed its most valuable asset, surprise. And by framing it as a foreign-backed operation rather than a domestic revolt, they delegitimized it before it could claim legitimacy. This is where the geopolitical implications become clear. What happened in Burkina Faso is not just a failed coup. It's a demonstration of a new model for preserving power in an era where traditional military force is increasingly insufficient. Traore's government didn't survive because it crushed a rebellion. It survived because it penetrated the conspiracy, exposed its external nodes, and used strategic signaling to isolate its backers. This is intelligence-driven statecraft, and it reflects lessons learned from recent coups across Africa and beyond. Governments are realizing that the most dangerous threats aren't the ones that come with tanks and declarations. They're the ones that come with encrypted apps, offshore accounts, and foreign facilitation. And the most effective responses aren't military crackdowns. They're intelligence operations that expose, isolate, and suffocate conspiracies before they can breathe. But this model only works if regional ambiguity collapses. For months, Togo and other coastal states could afford to remain vague about their positions. They could host exiles, allow financial transactions, and maintain diplomatic silence without facing consequences. Russia's intervention changed that. By publicly naming Togo and framing the coup as part of a broader destabilization campaign, Moscow forced every regional actor to declare a position. And once positions are declared, they become accountable. Togo couldn't arrest Damaba and then claim ignorance. Benin couldn't offer logistics and then plead neutrality. The conspiracy lost its oxygen not because it was militarily defeated, but because it was politically isolated. The offshore financing dimension reveals just how deeply embedded this operation was in global networks. Coups in Africa are often portrayed as spontaneous eruptions of local discontent, but the financial architecture behind this plot tells a different story. Money flowed through accounts in jurisdictions with weak oversight, moved through intermediaries with no obvious connection to Burkina Faso, and arrived in ways that avoided domestic banking systems. This required expertise. It required contacts. It required the kind of international facilitation that only comes from actors with significant resources and geopolitical motives. Who those actors are remains unclear, but the structure itself points to involvement far beyond the region. This was not funded by disgruntled officers pooling their salaries. This was funded by entities with strategic interests in Burkina Faso's political trajectory. Traore himself remains an enigmatic figure, and that ambiguity is part of his power. He is young enough to embody generational change, but experienced enough to have navigated Burkina Faso's brutal internal politics. He speaks the language of sovereignty and anti-imperialism that resonates deeply with populations exhausted by foreign intervention and elite corruption. But he also governs through military structures, relies on Russian support, and presides over a state still struggling with jihadist violence and economic fragility. His survival of this coup attempt strengthens him domestically, but it also deepens his dependence on Moscow. Every time a Western-backed plot fails and a Russian-backed government endures, the Sahel's geopolitical realignment becomes harder to reverse. The regional architecture is shifting in ways that will define West Africa for the next decade. The coastal states, Ghana, Benin, Togo, Ivory Coast, have traditionally served as stabilizing forces, economically connected to global markets and politically aligned with Western partners. But the Sahel's pivot toward Russia has created a new axis of instability running through the interior. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are now governed by military regimes that view France and ECOWAS as adversaries and Russia as a patron. This ideological and security divide is not just rhetorical, it's operational. It affects trade routes, security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic alignment. And as this divide deepens, the space for ambiguity shrinks. States will increasingly be forced to choose sides, and those choices will determine everything from military partnerships to economic access. What's most striking about this entire episode is how little violence it required. The conspiracy was dismantled through intelligence work, strategic signaling, and diplomatic isolation. Damaba was arrested quietly. The network was rolled up methodically. There were no dramatic firefights, no televised trials, no public executions. The coup died in silence because its oxygen was cut off before it could ignite. This is a far cry from the chaotic, kinetic responses that have defined coup attempts in the past. It reflects a maturation of statecraft in the region, a recognition that the most effective way to prevent coups is not to fight them after they start, but to suffocate them before they can organize. Is this a strategic victory for Traore, or just a temporary reprieve? That question hangs over Burkina Faso as the country moves deeper into Russian alignment and further from Western influence. The conspiracy's failure doesn't eliminate the underlying tensions that made it possible. Burkina Faso remains fragile. Its security situation is dire. Its economy is struggling. Its political legitimacy rests on military power and populist rhetoric, not democratic institutions or inclusive governance. Another coup attempt is not a question of if, but when, and the next one may learn from this one's mistakes. It may be more decentralized, harder to penetrate, less dependent on external logistics. The intelligence war is never over. It just moves to the next phase. For Togo, the arrest of Damaba is a humiliation and a warning. Lomé discovered that hosting exiles comes with costs it may not be able to afford. It learned that neutrality is no longer a viable strategy in a region where great powers are actively competing for influence. And it learned that Russia, unlike France, does not tolerate ambiguity when its interests are at stake. Togo will now have to recalibrate its entire regional posture, navigating between Western partners who want it to resist Russian expansion and a Russian-backed Sahel bloc that will not forgive perceived betrayal. This is the impossible geography of small states caught between larger force. For Russia, this is vindication. Moscow's investment in the Sahel is paying dividends not just in resource access or geopolitical leverage, but in demonstrable influence over regional outcomes. Russia didn't just warn Togo. It compelled action. It reshaped behavior. It demonstrated that its protection of allied governments is credible and its intelligence reach is extensive. Every African leader watching this will draw conclusions about who can be relied upon and who cannot. And those conclusions will shape alignment decisions for years to come. For France and the West, this is another defeat in a region slipping steadily out of reach. Paris has lost military bases, political influence, and ideological credibility across the Sahel. Its attempts to maintain leverage through economic ties and diplomatic pressure are increasingly ineffective. And its reliance on coastal allies like Togo to serve as bulwarks against Russian expansion has proven unreliable. The coup against Traore was in many ways a last-ditch effort to reverse the tide. Its failure suggests that the tide may now be irreversible. What comes next for Western policy in the Sahel is unclear. But what is clear is that the old playbook no longer works. What happens next in Burkina Faso could redefine not just the Sahel, but the broader contest for influence across Africa. Traore has survived, but survival is not stability. His government remains dependent on Russian support, vulnerable to internal fractures, and challenged by an insurgency that shows no signs of fading. The conspiracy's exposure may deter future plots, but it also revealed just how deeply external actors are embedded in Burkina Faso's internal politics. Every faction, every exile, every disgruntled officer is now a potential node in someone's larger strategy. And in that environment, intelligence becomes the most valuable currency. Not troops, not weapons, not speeches. Intelligence. The ability to see plots before they materialize, to map networks before they activate, to isolate conspiracies before they can build momentum. This is the new reality of African geopolitics. Coups are no longer just about generals and barracks. They are about encrypted communications and offshore financing. They are about foreign facilitation and strategic signaling. They are about intelligence penetration and perception management. And the governments that survive are the ones that understand this shift and adapt accordingly. Traore's Burkina Faso has adapted. Whether that adaptation can be sustained, whether it can be replicated, and whether it can ultimately deliver the security and prosperity that populations demand, those are the questions that will determine the Sahel's future. For now, the conspiracy has failed. The network has collapsed. And the region has received a stark reminder that in the modern game of coups and counter-coups, the quietest moves are often the most decisive.